as I've looked at it and as I've studied it, it's just been evolving so fast, partly because the data of the dead is now building up and building up and building up online and becoming more of a critical issue for all of the data controllers that house and manage that data, but also just an issue for us all societally, because we're in a really interesting situation where the dead and the living mix and mingle in online spaces to a greater extent than the dead and the living have since at any time, like since before the Industrial Revolution, when the spaces for the sick and the well and the living and the dead started separating, you know.
That was our guest today, Dr. Elaine Kasket. Elaine is a counselling psychologist, journalist, and author of the book All the Ghosts in the Machine, The Digital Afterlife of Your Personal Data. In this book, Elaine documents how the digital age affects how we live and how we die, and also how that affects the living. In this episode, Elaine talks with us about the far-reaching impacts of our digital footprints, who is really responsible for our digital legacy, and why death in the digital age is more closely related to data and power than anything else. This is a truly fascinating episode, and I hope you enjoy listening to Dr. Elaine Kasket. Elaine, welcome to Digital Mindfulness. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm really looking forward also to discussing these incredibly topical themes from your book. So welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited.
So Elaine, introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit more about your work and, more importantly, how you came to be focusing on this intersection of digital and the afterlife.
I'm a counseling psychologist, first and foremost. I trained as a psychologist. I also trained as a journalist back in the day, but I kind of deviated into psychology from there. And now is a moment in my life when I'm bringing the journalist and the psychologist back together. And right around 2006, which is kind of a watershed year in a lot of ways for social media, with YouTube and Facebook and Twitter all kind of bursting onto the scene at once, I joined Facebook myself and was nosing around and came upon, this was probably late 2006, a in memory of group for a young woman who'd passed away, which is how Facebook used to do it before they memorialized profiles, before they had that process. And the psychologist in me, my attention was immediately captured by how people were behaving on that site. And I was able to click to it through to her in-life profile as well to see how people were behaving and interacting and using that profile as well. So having been an academic at that time and teaching on psychology doctoral programs, I immediately applied for ethical approval to do a proper academic study and spent loads of years talking to other academics and other practitioners who are interested in death or bereavement. And I was kind of there in that space around the emotional side and the psychological side of grief and mourning. So that's where I was. But then as time went on, I found myself getting, as the social media giants grew into even bigger giants, and as all sorts of questions about privacy and ethics started coming to the fore, and as things like Cambridge Analytica started happening, I became increasingly interested in death not as the focus, but as a lens to understand a lot more about privacy, about the control that we give to big tech, about the control that big tech takes, about the ownership of our digital identities and our ongoing digital identities after we're gone by these big behemoth corporations. And that's what I found myself really wanting to talk about, and not just to an audience of academics and practitioners in the psychological space or the psychotherapeutic space, but to basically anybody who is building a digital footprint, which in the world is most of us. I wanted to really use this to get people thinking about, what are we doing, giving over all of this incredible control over telling our stories or shaping our identities or framing our bereavement to big tech companies. Why are we outsourcing all that to them and letting them take that away from us? So that's what I decided to write about. So I pitched a book, got a book contract, and here we are. So I've got All the Ghosts in the Machine, which is my book.
I think that's a really fascinating story. And in particular, the thing that jumps out at me is what happened to us when we died digitally before this age of social media and smartphones and the ubiquity of being digital. So I'm wondering if you can talk to that a little bit more, specifically the timeline of what happens to people digitally when they die. What happened to that data and who owned it?
Yeah, we were talking about the whole kind of 2005, 2006 when the Web
Mm.
2.0 stuff really got going because, it's hard to remember now, but before that period of time, if you didn't know a lot about computers or about coding or about whatever, like you weren't making a massive digital footprint. All of these companies and corporations weren't taking and storing, our data online. This just wasn't happening to the extent that it so ubiquitously happens now. And so when somebody passed away, as it had been since time immemorial, it was more the inner circle of people in your life, your family and your next of kin who had the greatest level of access to your personal effects, which included your personal information. If you had a box of letters lying around in your home, it was the people with access to your home that would have access to those letters or the photo albums or whatever. So the family were the inner circle of mourners, and they were the people with access to your stuff. And, they had control over what happened to your physical body and making arrangements for that. And the social media era is the era of the friend, where the balance of power in death and after death is completely flipped, where you may have family members who weren't on Facebook or Instagram or grandparents or whatever that might not have been on social media with the person that they lost. And they're having to appeal to the friends for access to memorabilia like photographs, since things are so almost universally digitally stored these days and shared. So you've got this flip and balance of power where the family can be on the margins. It used to be friends who were the marginalized mourners. You might not even realize their connection to the person who died. You might not realize their investment because family were at the center. So that reversal of power and access and control is absolutely fascinating. And now we have this whole class of stuff, digital legacy, digital estate, whatever you want to call it, for which the law doesn't really cover it very well. And there's all this like, what is this stuff and who owns it and who controls it? And now we're being told that we need to make provisions for our digital estate, which we kind of do, but there's no template for that because it's so different from the offline physical tangible stuff that laws around probate or wills or whatever is always dealt with before. So we're in this really weird area where there's all of this stuff that people need to be looking after or closing down or taking care of, and nobody knows how to do it.
I think this is such a fascinating topic, and in particular, the thing that interests me are people's reactions to this. Because when you do speak about death and the afterlife and how that's represented online, that's really the entry point, because then it's a very quick step to talking about things like data, about privacy, and all of these real world tangible issues that we need to be thinking about right now. So I'm wondering if you can talk to that a little bit. What have the reactions been to people, from people, to your work?
Yeah, when you're an author, so I'd written academic stuff before and published before, but of course, when you're going into writing a book for anybody and everybody, immediately it's like, what is the pitch? How do you market it? What's it about? Where in the bookstore is it located? Or what are the keywords on Amazon or whatever? Oh man, this book has been a nightmare because it's very hard to convince a publisher who's looking to make money, of course, that like, oh, this book about death, is going to go really well. And the thing of it is, and the thing that I wish, if I could do one thing, Lawrence, and go back and sort of repitch or kind of repackage this book, I would make more clear or get into that marketing how much it is more about privacy and data and control and like our relationship with big tech, and the thing about death just being the lens, because people do tend to shy away. So if they mistake it for a book about grief, or they mistake it for a book about estate planning, or like you need to plan or do your will or whatever it is, I mean, you might get that from this book for sure, but that's not really the main kind of thrust of it. So it's difficult. People kind of have this immediate like, oh, you're the person who talks about death. which is really frustrating because I'm just like, I'm here to talk to you about the like data choices, the privacy choices you're making every day of your life, and like what fascinating short and long term implications of that are. So there's this little death hump that needs to be got over, where people are like, oh, are you going to make me uncomfortable? Are you going to like make me think about things I'd rather put off? But it's all right, like once you get into the position of being able to talk to it about it for a few minutes, people get it, but you got to get in the door. It's kind of like they think you're the Grim Reaper knocking at the door, and actually, it's such an interesting, vital, wide-ranging conversation when you dig into it.
So those were the reactions from other people, but I'm also interested to know what happened to you as a result of focusing on this subject matter for a long time, for the whole process of writing this book. Did it change your perception of death? And in particular, did it also change the way that you behave right now online?
Well, the landscape is changing all the time. And so, when I started researching this, it was way back in, so 2007. And now here we are 13 years later. And I think that as I've looked at it and as I've studied it, it's just been evolving so fast, partly because the data of the dead is now building up and building up and building up online and becoming more of a critical issue for all of the data controllers that house and manage that data, but also just an issue for us all societally, because we're in a really interesting situation where the dead and the living mix and mingle in online spaces to a greater extent than the dead and the living have since at any time, like since before the Industrial Revolution, when the spaces for the sick and the well and the living and the dead started separating. And most people have never seen a dead body, in a lot of cultures, in Western cultures, many people have never seen, whereas in a long time ago, death and life were much closer together. And it's fascinating how in online spaces, and I think this is one of the things that kind of surprised me, or I realized as I went along, I'm just thinking, God, the presence of the dead and the presence of death online in a way is so close. Lots of people, almost everybody's got a story now about somebody they know who's still online but who's dead, of encountering, this kind of thing online. We see violence and death and terrorist attacks or whatever. We can watch these things on our phones, on the tube. In so many ways, death has become so much closer to us in the era of smartphones and information and digital stuff, but it's mediated, it's like filtered through our screens, it's filtered through all of these machines, and so it's simultaneously closer to us and further away. And we're using our phones for two things. We're either using them to like process our emotions and like feel stuff and feel fear and feel sadness and contact grief when we've lost somebody or when something terrible happens, and then the next minute we could be using it to distract us and buffer us against all those feelings by going and playing Candy Crush or something else. So it's the tool that we use to distract as well as to bring us closer to the reality of death. So that's incredibly interestingly paradoxical, and that's an example of how I think about things now that I just didn't even have in my head in 2006, 2007, 2008, because the critical mass of online dead hadn't even like built up. It was still this really novel kind of phenomenon. And now it's just not. So all the time, I feel like I'm developing my thinking on stuff, but that's just not my brain. That's just because different stuff is happening or more stuff is happening all the time.
I think listening to this, Elaine, what really springs out to me is the idea that death in a digital age becomes less and less intangible and less almost like spiritual. It's actually something that we interact with very, very closely on a day-to-day basis, particularly with, for example, social media profiles that follow us on our smartphones. And this is very different, I think, to the period of time when smartphones were not available, because computing and the presence of the deceased were not around us all the time. But now that is the case.
Everything that was once ephemeral is now largely being
Good
captured,
point.
right?
Yeah.
And there are no virtual beetles or digital, kind of carrion, worms or whatever that kind of go around nibbling. There's no nibbling all traces of you after you're gone. There's no switch that gets thrown when you're not physically there anymore. So in 2006, I think the iPhone was actually unveiled in that year. But of course, now the penetration of that and people and devices like that is, it's like over 80% in the UK. And so, the digital footprints that we put down back then were footprints. Now, to call them footprints is selling it short. It's like digital identities. It's like digital reflections. If you have an AI that is not rooted in new programming, but is actually based in the data set, like left behind by a real person who once walked the earth, so that AI then somehow can become a continuation of that individual, like that is nowhere near where were in 2006. But now the Be Right Back episode of Black Mirror that a lot of people have seen from the second season, where this guy's social media presence, emails, everything was scraped to then form this approximation of him. Like the best sci-fi, we are in a world where we recognize that scene. It doesn't seem so uncanny anymore. Like, people aren't calling it creepy. They're not saying, oh, this is too creepy, this is weird. They're sort of saying, oh, well, how far are we off that exactly? Are we already there? And the answer to that is, yeah, we're there. And that's because it isn't just digital footprints, it's digital identities. Not for everybody, of course, but it's hard not to be when devices capture stuff by default, when there's all of this passively recorded information as well as actively, logged information, where you can triangulate all these little bits of info. If somebody had access to everything, all your accounts, they had all your passwords, they had all your iPhone location data, they had your GPS tracking, they had your websites visited, they had your search history, they had your facial recognition technology bleeps from wherever you were, they had all of it, as well as your social media posts and everything else. The kind of incisive, deep biography they could really make about you would be extraordinary. It would just be beyond the dreams of any like traditional pre-digital biographer, like what you could tell about that person. Because our digital footprint, if somebody has access to all of it, it doesn't just show them the person they knew in the face that person puts to the world. It shows them the person that they didn't. It shows them the person who didn't even know they were betraying various things about themselves, about their internal world. Through our digital reflection, our internal self, the person that often can't be seen by the outside world, you get a window into that. You get lots of windows into that. And that's why the digital self is such an extraordinary thing. And if you can access that after somebody's death, that is something else. So we're coming now to a point where I think we need to start questioning the deceased's ongoing right to data protection and to privacy, something that the deceased have never had before. We're at a point where we need to start asking those questions. GDPR didn't cover the data of the dead. My argument is that next iteration really needs to.
Elaine, we've been talking a lot about social media specifically, I think because it's just front and center when we start to think of our online personas and how that might live after us, after we die. But when we think also about the other digital touch points that we interact with, because as you mentioned, this is all about data, right? This is all about how we're represented in data. The picture becomes much more complex, but it's far, far richer. Our digital personas are incredibly rich. So I'm thinking, for example, of say my Apple Watch, for example. This can track exactly where I go. It tracks all of my entire health, or to a lesser or greater degree, my health profile. I'm thinking of my Spotify profile. It understands not just what I listen to, but how I listen to music. And all of this combined together is such an incredibly rich representation of me, not just digitally, but in my, just me as a person.
And that explains, people think that their phones are listening to them, and in some instances they are. There was a fascinating episode of Reply All that really sort of explained all of this, that kind of was a bit of a wake-up call for me. But your phone doesn't have to listen to you in order to be able to uncannily accurately sends you the advert that, just at the time that you're thinking of something, because all of those other little bits of data that you just mentioned, brought together and synthesized, it's incredibly powerful in terms of predicting behavior. So your behavior is being reinforced and your behavior is being predicted. And then, every time you confirm or disconfirm that prediction by clicking on the advert that they send you or not, or acting on it or not, that's another little piece of information logged that allows the algorithms to predict your behavior that much better than they did before. So even your non-engagement with something can tell the algorithm something about you, and so it's a really powerful thing. In 2006, and this is a story that I tell in my book, in the early days, America Online, there was a data leak that released the search data, so the sort of search histories of thousands and thousands of AOL users, America Online users. And it was supposed to be just released to researchers, but somehow it got released to the public at large. And in very short order, a reporter from the New York Times identified, even though it was completely anonymized, was able to identify specific individuals from that data leak, and then go to Florida or Georgia or whatever to interview them about how they felt about everybody looking over your shoulder. But more fascinatingly to me, a couple of filmmakers a couple of years later took the search history of one of these searchers. I think it was like 711298 or something. And they did this film that was consisting solely of an actress reading out these search, terms. And it was like reading a Russian novel. You knew exactly what was going on. You know what these women's fears were. You knew what her insecurities and doubts were. You were seeing into the dark night of this woman's soul, and you could see the scenarios playing out and where she was at. I was sitting in a coffee shop listening to it. It was on YouTube, the movie they made. And I was like, oh my God, no, don't do it. Like, you could see what was happening, and the pathos was incredible. It was search history. And that woman didn't know that she was authoring some sort of autobiographical document by sitting in her house at 3 a.m. plugging search terms into a computer. And she certainly didn't know that one day that was going to result in a data leak that was going to this day, she might not know that these two European filmmakers made this film, which is called I Love Alaska. It's divided into like 13 mini movies, like 5-minute segments. She'll have no idea, but oh my God, it was really, really, really telling. So this is we think all the time about the performative stuff we do on social media and how we curate our online presence and all that jazz. But if we die, that might not be the thing that's most telling about us. If our family gets our laptop, or our partner gets hold of our phone and is able to unlock it, there's so much more that we don't realize we're telling the world about us.
Elaine, in one sense, this gives me a lot of comfort, knowing that, because in the past, perhaps before digitization, the only way that perhaps we could interact with the dead, as you mentioned, was either through the family, through these artifacts like images or diaries. And diaries are hard to keep. They were hard then to keep. They're hard now to keep. Or with books, the authors from the past. But now we're authoring our lives without even knowing it, just through our lives. And so in a way that gives me an enormous sense of comfort, because that in theory could be something you can pass on. Right?
In theory. That's the tricky bit. That's the thing, though. The whole outsourcing your memory thing, and outsourcing your, putting the control over of all of these sentimental memorabilia, these kinds of precious artifacts that might be valuable to the people who know and love us, or might be valuable in many ways to our descendants, whether that's just about understanding where you came from or whatever that means to you, kind of personal meaning making, like genealogists are engaging in when they do family history research, right? There's a lot of ways in which the information and the kind of traces that we leave behind could be really valued by people who are come after or who are left behind. But when we're leaving the control and the power of that information in the hands of GAFA, Google and Apple and Facebook and Amazon, And you see all this stuff in the media, how there was a Twitter storm recently in November when Twitter announced that it was going to start doing a cull of inactive accounts in December 2019. And there was an outcry from bereaved people because an inactive account cull is essentially a delayed delete upon death policy in many cases. That because the reason that a Twitter account is inactive might be because that person is no longer alive. So there was an outcry from the bereaved, and Twitter backpedaled, and they said, "Oh, so sorry, we didn't realize," which is funny because it should be news to no one in Silicon Valley that these digital, remains can be valuable to people. And this is why one of the reasons Facebook and Instagram have, kind of memorialized. And they said, "Oh, we're going to look into memorialization." Now, okay, why should we expect, just for play devil's advocate, why should anybody expect a company like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram to memorialize the dead ad infinitum, kind of overheating their servers, managing this data, like memorializing this stuff in a sensitive way? Like, why are we placing that expectation and responsibility on social media companies to do that? And why are we, and then we're sitting most of the time because we know that we can't really trust them. And it's kind of like outsourcing protection of hens to foxes, that at any moment, if it doesn't suit their coffers or their business purposes or change their T's and C's, that could go. A lot of people do feel comfort that there is something still in the world, digital remains that retain that vitality of the person they lost. They can access it 24/7. They can connect with the community of mourners. But people also know that one day they could wake up and that could all go, that could be removed from them, and it can, but then, so we're outsourcing the responsibility for preserving this stuff to companies who didn't come into being for that, and for whom it might not always be in their best interest, and they don't really care about it. They don't really care about it. They care about the bottom line. Of course they care about the bottom line, and they didn't go into business as digital cemeteries. That's not their business model. Do they actually have a moral obligation to retain these things, especially when it becomes pragmatically not feasible for them? So why are we entrusting and expecting social media companies to do our remembering and sort of honoring for us?
Elaine, when talking about the representation of death online, you've spoken a couple of times about power and control. And I'd like you to just go into that a little bit more, because again, from my perspective, it seems that you're talking about data, and in particular access to data. And is that really the axis of power and control that you're speaking of?
Absolutely. And you asked a minute ago about like pre-digital stuff, and what happened in death. And there were really clear guidance for that, in the law, in terms of, what happens to property or somebody's stuff when there is a will, when there isn't a will, what kind of stuff can you bequeath in a will, what can you not, and there was a clarity about that, and that had not changed that much for a very long time. So the kind of take-home message that a lot of people had, even if they don't know that much about how estates or wills work, they were aware that the direction of travel was kind of like next of kin, ish, like that, unless you said otherwise, your next of kin or your estate was going to go, to, your nearest and dearest, or whoever is defined like that. And so people go around kind of assuming in a knee-jerk way that digital stuff conforms to the same kinds of like systems as physical stuff, and it doesn't. So people say, "Oh, I want to bequeath my iTunes library to my brother, so I'm going to write that down. I'm going to put that in my will." Well, good luck with that, because you can't bequeath something that you didn't own in the first place. You've only, purchased a license to listen to that stuff or watch that stuff while you're alive. It's one account, one user. It's non-transferable. It's not transferable upon death. But people they don't realize that, or they think, but it's mine. I've paid money. Like, it has value. Of course I can transfer it. Well, that's not what it says in the fine print. And there's been lots of bereaved person versus, Apple confrontations to illustrate that. I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon. I think that there are some really significant problems that occur when you kind of move away from the one user, one account kind of model. And it opens up the door to all sorts of additional complications in terms, impersonation and companies not knowing who their users are. So what people find when they're bereaved is they think that the access or the control or the power they think they're gonna have or that they should have to see somebody's messages or to operate their account or to kind of keep their email going or whatever it is, they are often surprised when they don't have that, or when a big tech company says, oh, I'm so sorry, no, we're the guardians of that particular gate. It's important for us to safeguard this account or the contents of the account, and I don't care who you are, you can't have it. That's not in our terms and conditions. That catches a lot of people by surprise, and they have this feeling like, well, that's not how it should be. But essentially you've handed over that control and that power a long time ago when you signed up to the service, and that's always how it's been. And people think it's like morally, bankrupt or something, family members get really upset, but, this isn't the level on which companies are considering the matter. They care about customer relations, but they don't care about the moral principles in the way that the families do.
So Elaine, you've spoken that there's a process of memorialization on a few of these online platforms, but I'm not really sure what that is. Can you just explain what that is and how that actually works for just a couple of these providers?
I'll talk about it specifically with respect to the social media accounts, which is really the only place where it happens. So Facebook, because Google does an inactive account manager, but that's not quite the same as memorialization, because memorialization implies this is a memorial and people can still visit it and access it, and it's kind of representative of the dead person's life. So I mentioned in 2007, it was after the Virginia Tech massacre in 2007, April 2007, that Facebook started memorializing profiles. And that was in response to feedback. People said, please don't delete these, because they had a delete upon death policy. They said, please don't delete these. These are important memorials of these people who lost their lives. And Facebook has memorialized profiles in one form or another ever since. When memorialization happens, the ability to log into the account or log on to the account becomes disabled. That facility is no longer there, which means that if somebody in that person's circle has the password, that's not going to work. It's unlogonable, which of course does serve to also protect. It prevents impersonation, but it also protects the privacy of all the still living users who are in that deceased entity's network, which is a really important point that we might discuss at some other stage. And so memorialization sort of freezes it from being logged into and protects that data, but then it's still available and online and in holding the same place that it was before. It's not like shuffled into some sort of separate data heaven or kind of profile symmetry. It's kind of mixed up with all the in alphabetical order with all the other people in your friends list on Facebook at the moment. So they've evolved this over time. They introduced something called a legacy contact who sort of manages it. And they didn't used to be able to do much. They used to be able to, change the profile picture, the banner picture. And they used to be able to add people who weren't on the person's original friends list. And in April of 2019, they expanded the powers of legacy contact, giving them loads of editorial control or like moderator control, which is kind of if you're appointed an executor for a physical estate, it can be complicated, but you know that one day the estate's all wound up and you can get on with your life. Whereas if you're a legacy contact for an ongoing Facebook profile, that's kind of like you're now moderator of this online forum for an indefinite period of time, which is actually a pretty hefty thing to be responsible for. And they introduced a separate tab, like a tribute section, and they reorganized it. So they keep on trying to kind of do it better and find better ways or trying to help people have better experiences. Instagram obviously is owned by Facebook. It's a similar sort of thing. And Twitter doesn't have memorialization yet. And that's the whole controversy in November of last year, is the question of, do we go ahead with our calls or do we introduce memorialization like our colleagues over at Facebook and Instagram have? So that's it in a nutshell, really. It just it provides this online space where people can continue to have access to the content they could always see before.
I think in addition to this Facebook memorialization, I know I've mentioned this previously, but it is really important to remember that there are other footprints that we leave, deep footprints around the web. We do have, say, our Netflix profiles that, that shows not what we watch, but how we watch. We've got our Spotify profiles as well.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah,
I
who's qualified to contact Tinder to let Tinder know that you're dead? Like, what evidence do they have to provide to Tinder to say that you're dead? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there a process? I don't know. But like for every single service you use where you've got an agreement with them, do they have the people and the resources and the processes in place so that a bereaved person can go and do whatever needs to be done with those accounts? But we don't think about all those elements. Like you say, they're scattered everywhere. They're spread so wide over the internet.
So if this is the case, it really strikes me that there should be one company that families should be reaching out to instruct all of these other companies to submit the data of their loved ones. And I'm wondering, is there an industry, like a kind of digital death or memorialization industry?
I mean, this is a business model that, is being worked on. I think there are a lot of people thinking exactly that question. There have been digital legacy companies and digital vaults and password vaults and, like sort of dual, and in order for that to work, it almost has to be something where you give that app or you give that service, for the person in life would have to give that app or give that service permission to kind of log, kind of like everything, and essentially be something that can, after your death, can be authorized to, for all intents and purposes, kind of impersonate you to close it all down, or, or you have to, or maybe there could be something that actually goes through official government sources where you're like, okay, I'm logging it with this government department. You tell them once and they take care of all of these different platforms. But then if you kind of think about the mechanics of that, you'd almost have to have, I don't know if you've read Dave Eggers' The Circle or seen The Circle on Netflix, but it's like a Facebook-esque kind of company, and it poses a lot of privacy questions. But one of the devices in that plot was this kind of true you kind of thing, where there's this one portal where basically anything you do on the internet is stamped with your unique footprint, like thumbprint kind of thing. So that means that you can easily kind of like collect up all of the data that is your personally identifiable, linked to you kind of thing. And until we have that kind of mechanism where it's kind of easy to reliably identify, which data belong to you or associated with you, and easy to identify with certainty that this person is physically deceased, unless you've got those two things operating together, and you can be sure that all of the information isn't going to be hacked before your death for nefarious purposes, then you can have something like that. But until that day, it remains extremely complex. And I'm not even saying that day is necessarily something we should be aspiring to, where everything you do on the internet is linked to your, kind of unique thing. So there are a lot of issues with it. There are a lot of security issues with it.
So we've been talking about death online at kind of quite a high level, quite abstract. And just to bring things back to the book, in your book, you have one chapter that focuses specifically on grief and how that has changed in the digital age. And I'm wondering if you can talk to that a little bit more, because that was a really fascinating chapter, particularly how that process has changed and adapted to digitization.
Well, one of the things that I have to underscore, this is something that a lot of people misunderstand, and the algorithms that are out there help us misunderstand it. Because do a little experiment after this podcast, or anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you go to your phone or go to your computer and type grief into the search engine, and it suggests, or predicts what you're going to say next, see what it says. It's very likely to say stages of, and then try it the other way, like type in stages and it'll say of grief, um, and so we think of grief as like following particular rules, unfolding in a particular way. Stage models of grief were really popular and really kind of assumed to be true in a lot of the 20th century. And I just want to correct that misapprehension, which is not well supported in research. Grief is incredibly individual. It's so idiosyncratic. Just as every relationship you have in life is unique, so is every bereavement. So there is no one size fits all. And that's why it gets really complicated when a big company like Facebook that has literally only a handful of people working on its legacy contact and memorialization models, a handful of people who live in Silicon Valley with a very particular Silicon Valley culture, imposing their assumptions about what's good and bad and healthy and unhealthy and helpful and unhelpful in grief on 2 point whatever billion regular users throughout the world from all walks of life and from all sorts of very local cultures of grief, and local conventions of grief. That's why any sort of model for like, oh, let's frame grief or let's frame memorialization this way on a site like Facebook, I think is always sort of doomed to failure, because for every person who wants a birthday reminder, from a deceased person's account, another person's going to be horrified. For every person that relies on that profile in their grief and would be devastated if it disappeared, there's somebody who wants it gone. And it's not like one person's doing it right and the other person's not doing it right, or one person's healthy and one person's not. It's just that individual. And so I talk about that in the chapter, because that's a really important thing for people to understand. And I think the message from that is that, until such point as we've got greater data portability or a more decentralized web where we do have more say so over what happens to our, data that's associated with us, the only way forward is to give individual users, potentially more fine-grained control over the kind of interaction or the kind of, relationship that they want to have with a persistent profile of somebody. Because individual users with their individual grief experiences don't currently have that fine-grained level of control. And all of the protestations about, design not lending itself to it or it's being too hard, I don't buy it. And so that chapter is really getting people to think about how all of these different really individual cultures or expectations or experiences of grief from everywhere in the world come together on these centralized platforms. And there's all of this negotiation that happens. You've seen it happen when somebody is mourning a celebrity or saying things online about somebody who's died, and the grief police kind of swoop in and say, you shouldn't be doing that on here, and this is inappropriate, and this is appropriate. Everybody's trying to work out, like, how are you supposed to do it? Like, what's right and wrong, to feel and say in grief? And there's no answer to that question. There isn't. But still, everybody's fighting over it, like how you ought to be. They're sort of dueling out the etiquette of death and mourning online. So that chapter gets to grips with all of that kind of stuff. And that's where I started from. I'm a psychologist. Back in 2006, that's what got my attention. How are people mourning and grieving online? So I kind of started where I started with the book.
So Elaine, would you say then that digitization has changed the way that we grieve?
There's a lot more communication to the dead themselves, and this happens
Right.
even amongst people who are not religious. And it came as a bit of a surprise to me to realize that people who aren't religious often believe in an afterlife. And I think that people are experiencing the ongoing kind of presence of people online as a kind of almost technological, secular kind of afterlife. The kind of place where the dead hang out. And the same, or the haunting, of all of these posthumously persistent profile. So it's kind of weird how, the amount of interaction and the amount of kind of conversation. And I say conversation almost like it's two-way, because people will talk directly to the dead on social media or message their phones or whatever else. And then sometimes they'll say things like, you'll see them saying things like, thank you for sending me the rainbow, or, oh, I know you sent me that dream last night. So it's kind of like, I'm talking to you via these means, and I'm assuming you're getting the message, and I'm feeling like you're communicating back with me in other ways. So there's this kind of ongoing interaction in a different sort of way. I'm not saying that people didn't do that before. They did. They did sort of reach out and call out to the dead, often using whatever communication technologies of the day as well. whether they were writing a letter or whether they were, going to a spook photographer to see if the spirit would materialize beside them, in the late 19th century, whatever it was. People reached out in this way, but now it's just a lot easier because the dead are kind of already there in the tech. Their shadows haven't gone anywhere, they're still there, and you find them in the same places you did before. So that's new, that you don't have to go somewhere different to connect with the dead. It's not hard. They're in the palms of your hands, and in some ways they look a lot like they always did, or the reflections are still there. So that's massively different. There's a lot of issues around access and control and ownership and insecurity about the permanence or not of the digital artifacts. There's a comfort, but there's also a kind of fear that, like, oh, well, what if this goes, or can I be sure it's going to stick around? And if there's instances of data loss or loss of access, people have this kind of traumatized kind of second loss. It's like losing them all over again, and they get scared, and there's a scrabbling to try to kind of like capture or download data that they are now realizing they didn't have control over. So there's that kind of insecurity that happens. So those are a couple ways in which, although there's a lot that is the same or continuous, these are things that stand out about grieving in a digitally mediated space.
One of the things that we're told repeatedly about the way that we act and our journeys online is that we have to be very careful. In fact, we should put less things online because these digital footprints follow us around forever. Data doesn't die. But after listening to you, it seems that if we are conscious of the fact that we're building up essentially a legacy of ourselves online, that we need to be more conscious of the quality of our digital footprint online, that actually we need to be more focused on creating higher quality content and having higher quality interactions, if all of that is going to stay forever and be a representation of us after we're gone.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because humans being humans, not all humans have like mega skeletons in their closet. People are very multifaceted creatures, and I think historically, prior to now, Victor Meyer-Schoenberger at the Oxford Internet Institute has talked about, for the first time in history, it's harder to forget than it is to remember, because all of these devices and all this stuff, so much stuff is being stored, and so everything's there. So it's like, if you imagine, for example, a widow or a widower who, if they do have access, because one of the problems might be is they have no access. And then there might be the problem of accessing everything. Like, there are emotional pitfalls in both, right? So if you access everything and you come upon stuff that surprises you, or you didn't know, or that challenges you or challenges your vision of that person in some kind of way, and that person is no longer there to have a conversation with, whether that conversation is about clarity or checking something out or verifying, or maybe the conversation is about healing or reparation, or letting somebody know how you feel about a betrayal or something else that you might discover. I mean, this is really because we our devices, either passively, like we were talking about before, or you actively, every single correspondence you've ever engaged in, every single message, some of which might be a bit ambiguous, every place you've ever been, oh, what was he doing in the lobby of that hotel on that day? And then you go back through your iCal and you think, oh, well, that's not where he was supposed to be on that day. That's not where it says in his calendar. Who was that then? Oh, what's this email on that day? Who's that woman? Is that a colleague? It just, like, not every person is tempted to go overall detective, on their deceased, kind of loved one's digital legacy. But if there were complex things in the relationship, if there was something complicated about the death, a mysterious death, a suicide, a homicide, something unresolved, sometimes people go into those looking for answers, the digital legacy. Sometimes they go looking for comfort, and they find something that they don't expect. They don't find the comfort that they think they're going to find. They might find something that confuses them, and then they're kind of sitting with that. So that's one of the things. I mean, yeah, I mean, I what you say about being more curatorial and putting out more stuff that really like represents you as you would like to be remembered, for sure. And that's the performative side. But then there's the stuff that's not performative that just gets captured as you go, and the stuff that really is in your private life, your private thoughts. Sometimes you might be having a really bad day and you might be really pissed off at your partner or really pissed off, and you might write down all sorts of things, and that has its context. And there it is, and it's recorded. But then somebody finds that after you're gone and they don't have the context. And you're like, everybody deserves and should, and we need private spaces, in our lives. And when all those private spaces can get blown open and exposed, whether it's to big tech for sale, to advertising companies, or to our loved ones after we're gone, there's issues there, the erosion of private, experience is really, I think, is, consequential for us as individuals in society in ways that we're just beginning to understand.
So, Elaine, what do you think about regulation in helping these companies to be better stewards of our data, and I guess be better in bequeathing our information or supporting the whole death process?
Well, regulators are really scared of this, and it's understandable because I've been immersed in this now since 2006, and it, every way you turn, it's like going around a roundabout, and you would like to find your way off the roundabout and find your way forward to continue your journey. And every exit you take off the roundabout, you're like, oh, can't go that way. There's a problem. Like, go back on it. Oh, like, oh no, wait, oh, there's a problem. It's like just being in this never-ending maze, because you've got a cluster of all sorts of intersecting things that are really complicated. You've got stuff about data protection and privacy, and you've got stuff about contracts and contract law, and you've got stuff about wills and like probate and things, and then you've got stuff about I don't know, intellectual property or copyright, and you've got stuff about and so these things, and there's so many stakeholders, and with all sorts of different needs and agendas, and it's very, very difficult. Like, find me a lawyer that has expertise and in technology law as well. Oh, and international law, because of course you've got local people with local laws, but these are international platforms that then have their HQs over here in Menlo Park or whatever it is. So show me a lawyer who's got understanding, expertise in all of those areas. Show me any expert, and that's the problem, because especially since a lot of the senior regulators are people, increasingly less so, I guess, but are digital like immigrants, people who like don't really feel in their bones, in their blood, the kind of like assumptions or the understandings of a digital society. They're still kind of like, it's still not new to them, but they're digital immigrants. And so sometimes they make dumb decisions. In Germany last year, a court case was finally resolved, where a family had gone to Facebook saying our teenage daughter committed suicide. She was a minor. She was underage. We need access to her messenger. And Facebook said no, and the court upheld it. They went again. Facebook said no, the court upheld it. And then it went to the senior court, the highest court in the land. And a judge there, of an older generation, said, no, this is just the same as a box of letters. A family would have access to a box of letters. The family needs to have access to it. It is so different than a box of letters, not least of which the privacy of all the people that her account was connected to was compromised by giving access to those letters. And the Data Ethics Commission in Germany, in a paper just towards the latter part of last year, said we shouldn't take this decision of the High Court seriously, because they said all this stuff that was ephemeral is now being captured. This is huge. It's really a lot of privacy considerations. It is not the same. And I'm really glad the Data Ethics Commission did that. And we need to be thinking to the level of the Data Ethics Commission in Germany, and we need to be acting on this stuff. But I think we're really seriously lagging behind. But it's hard. It's super, super hard to cross. There's so many threads to it. And some of them are diametrically opposed in terms of their like interests.
You just mentioned Germany's Data Ethics Commission as an organisation and a state that's doing really good work. But what other states are pushing the needle in terms of the topics that we've spoken about today?
Well, I mean, the United States has something. It has a model law. It has a template law for this. I hesitate. I probably get it wrong. It's the Revised Uniform Access to Fiduciary Assets Act. RUFADA for yeah, and RUFADA, it sort of basically is a thing that says, amongst other things, if you say on a social media platform like Facebook, like on an online thing, this is what I want done with this, then that can be upheld in law. Even if it's not like written to a will, it can be legally, it can hold weight. So somebody sitting in the United States or in California who says, this is my legacy contact, and I want them, not my estate's next of kin, to decide what happens to my Facebook account or to manage it, that's upholdable in law. Whereas if you're sitting in the UK and you say the same thing, if your family wants to challenge that, they can challenge that because it doesn't actually hold legal weight. You won't find that in the fine print anywhere, but that's how it stands. And so people sometimes then think they've got the level of control over things, and they don't have it. Now, I think that the US is making better progress, therefore, in like dealing with this, but they're also powerfully in sway of the lobby, of the big tech lobby, who are some of the most powerful, richest lobbies in the world. So the United States has a system where, unfortunately, the government is very influenced by lobbies. And so there was a previous version of this model law that was probably took some power and control over data away from the big tech companies. And they, like Facebook and other big tech companies, protested. And that's how they end up with a revision to this law. So big tech companies were very, very involved in revising the law in a direction that was more in their favor. And that's just one more example of how companies like Facebook increasingly have more power in so many areas of our life than even the law does. And this has got to change. It has got to change. We can't have profit companies being quasi-governmental entities. It's just not cool.
We spoke earlier about that fabulous Black Mirror episode, Be Right Back. I absolutely love that episode. And I want to talk about the emulation of people that are deceased, particularly when using things like AI chatbots or deep fakes, the almost the resurrection for nefarious purposes or for other purposes that are not in tune with the family's wishes. What's your opinion on those, and in particular the potential for companies to safeguard our data, and also for people to be able to recognize the difference between something that has obviously been doctored and the true representation of a loved one or a well-known person?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, you might have seen in the news recently, they're even revivifying James Dean, as a
I
deep
saw
fake,
that.
in a new film. And of course, you've got these holographic tours and, of pop stars and people who died ages ago, Billie Holiday and Maria Callas and Roy Orbison, who wouldn't have had any sense of any of this, being trotted out, on stage with a Pepper's Ghost illusion. And it's a really, deep fakes, we had Nancy Pelosi, in that deep fake video of her looking drunk. And you still see people online thinking that video was actually Nancy Pelosi, intoxicated, and so this is the thing, we are already having conversations rightly about what ethics, what rights artificial intelligence, should have at such point that it gains a kind of intelligence in terms of the ability to solve complex problems, or the kind of a point of singularity, or whatever it is. Now we're talking about new programmed AI there. What about, as in the Be Right Back episode, an artificially intelligent entity that has its origins in a once living human being, so that there's a kind of continuity of one aspect of that person? And of course, this is an area that neuroscientists are interested in, kind of as well as technologists. But what rights does that entity have? Can we really then no longer say that that entity has no rights to data protection or privacy or anything else, when there's that aspect of it that's ongoing in an artificially intelligent form? That is a messed up kind of, that's why I'm arguing that we have to be dealing with this kind of thing now, because for anybody who hasn't seen the Be Right Back episode, this guy's is able to be revivified or sort of resurrected in bot form after his death, because through scraping everything that he did on social media and emails and video and audio and everything like that, this representation of him was able to emerge. Back more than a decade ago, when there was the Robin Williams film, The Final Cut, which involved, the concept was there was a chip called the Zoe chip that was implanted in people's brains when they were born. If you paid for it, it would capture everything that the person saw, through their eye, throughout the course of their life. And then when they died, this chip is removed and it's given to somebody called a cutter. Robin Williams was this cutter that they do an hour and a half video of this at a rememory service, which is the Funerals of the Future. It's basically the least popular film that Robin Williams ever made. It was so little in box office takings that people would have rather seen anything in the cinema that year, including foreign language films, than go see The Final Cut. But all the reviewers, they were like, it's creepy and it's weird and like, what crazy plot is this, and this is nuts and all this kind of stuff. But when Be Right Back came out, a few years ago, nobody was saying that. They were like, how close are we to it? Is it now? And so we're so, this is a very important question, because quite apart from AI in terms of nefarious purposes, it takes people a long time to deal with the digital portion of people's estates, because people don't plan for it. They don't know how to plan for it. And there's all these traces all over the web. I almost hesitate to say this on the air, but, an entrepreneurial criminal, by going through the obituary section, can say, oh, well, where's all the people who have died? And like, how can I strike at this person's digital identity now to drain their coffers before anybody's the wiser? This is a very important security issue. And this is one of the reasons why just leaving things open and not memorializing things or not closing things down and not having the mechanisms for that is a problem. It's a hole. It's a hole through which criminals can crawl and take stuff. And I find it sometimes hard to believe, because I'm so immersed in it, I guess, that people aren't waking up to this a lot faster than they are.
It's funny, isn't it? Because there was a massive campaign. I remember being told by so many people, you have to shred your letters before you throw them away, because people can take your address and then fill out loan applications in your name. And it's like, oh my God, okay.
Before you throw out your stuff into the rubbish bin, the recycling, put it through the shredder. Like, don't put your bank statements in the bin. Yeah, but everybody thinks about that stuff, but they don't, but they don't realize, obviously people are aware of identity theft online. They are, but they're not thinking about the kind of how might that data be exploited after death? I mean, the study by Barclays Bank, which may be invested in sort of skewing results in a particular way, but one of the things I talk about in my book is sharenting, and how we kind of contribute to other people's digital footprints and digital legacies. How we quite powerfully do that sometimes, and doing that for with children, the practice of sharing online information, sharenting. I'm a reformed sharenter myself, and I talk about that in the book. But by 2030, it's estimated that identity fraud relating to sharenting that parents did like 10 years prior or whatever is going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds a year, and then there may be 7 million cases annually of identity fraud based on the digital footprints created by parents about their children years earlier. So by the same token, identity fraud that can be committed against the estates of people who are no longer here can absolutely happen, especially in a climate where there's no infrastructure and no mechanisms and no processes to kind of report that death and have accounts closed down and all that kind of stuff.
It would seem then that the best thing for people to do is to learn to be a better digital citizen in terms of not only how we act online, but being better in understanding what we have a right to access online. And I'm thinking very much about digital housekeeping, insofar as lots of people are starting to become more aware of their right to their own information. So, for example, Google and Facebook allow you to access and download your data for the interactions that you have on their platforms, and that's starting to become increasingly well known. So what would you say are some of the steps that people should be taking to towards better digital housekeeping, and also preparing for the worst, should the worst happen, their digital profile and their digital identities. What should people be doing to prepare for that?
It's really difficult because it's got to, unless it's an ongoing kind of thing, you never know the hour of your death, do you? So, and most people don't, over half of UK adults don't make a will. These are the kinds of things we put off indefinitely. And because all of this information gets captured all the time, and who has got the time and resource to go around cleaning digital house all the time? I think it's fascinating that we're so preoccupied with decluttering and like Marie Kondo's methods, and all this stuff. And online, we're all these digital hoarders, but of course, this stuff is captured. If you're not actively looking at it, you don't realize, you don't see the glut of data in the same way that if you were hoarding newspapers, for example, you'd, walk into your front room and have it stacked to the rafters and have to navigate around it. The glut of information is not in our faces, we might only see it, we think, seeing a number in your inbox, is different than like dealing with huge stacks of papers in your house. And so we don't get immediately triggered, to clean stuff up because we're not aware of how dirty it is. So, I mean, I think that what I would say is that, that's the thing about curating. I mean, we're all drowning under this surfeit of data, so we can't even see the wood for the trees. We take thousands of digital photographs, but we like don't do anything with them and they just build up. And, I definitely periodically curate things. And for me, that form is often sort of taking things offline and bringing them into kind of local kinds of formats that I can control, whether that's local formats in terms of USB storage or whatever else, or whether that is sort of saying, out of these thousands of photographs, here's the 10 I really want to keep. Let me put it in a lovely book. Let me make a present of it to my daughter or her grandparents or whatever. And then I kind of render all of the data glut into a metabolizable form or a metabolizable memory that I get the pleasure in and that feels, reduced and distilled into something that's the most rich, most valuable stuff. And I've translated that into a form where I am making up my mind. It's my business. It's my memory. It's my curating. I'm not going to depend on anybody else. I'm not going to outsource my remembering and my deciding what's important to somebody else. So I'm doing that in my life as a life practice, which means that stuff is going to be accessible. I will have already decided throughout my life, what I want to remember, what I would like my immediate friends and family to remember, and what I would like descendants to remember and have half a chance of having access to. If I print out a photo book of a value of an event, my great grandchildren are going to have a whole lot better chance of seeing that than anything I post on Instagram or Facebook, just because by what mechanism are they going to see that picture? By what chain of like friends approvals is that even going to happen? It's impossible, and so I think I've changed a lot about how I live, and I mentioned being a reformed shareenter. I don't post so at the beginning of this year, I used an app to delete all of my past posts on Facebook, except for the ones in the past month. I deleted all the photographs of my daughter from Instagram that showed her face. I don't want facial recognition. I don't want to be feeding the beast with information about her that I don't know, what the consequence that's going to be for her future life, and advertisers getting hold of her and understanding her and all that stuff. Not down for it. And I wouldn't have gotten to that point if I hadn't written this book, which is ostensibly about death, but which is not. you know But I think that even though we've got a big old tangle, we can't be overwhelmed by that. We've got to really say, let me take this as an invitation to decide who and what is important in my life, and what I want to look back on at the end of my life, that I want something to kind of leave behind in the world. I don't need, don't let me sort of trust, big technology companies to be the carrier of my kind of memory going forward in the world. That's not something we can trust them or give them responsibility to do. That remains up to us, and how can we, in all sorts of ways, every day in our life, seize more control back from the big technology companies that have come to dominate us. We should be telling our own stories and framing our own stories. We shouldn't be letting some big social media company do that for us.
So, Elaine, where can people find out more about you and your work and connect with you?
All right. So you can find out more about me and my work on ElaineKasket.com. I blog regularly on Medium under the Elaine Kasket handle. So I write on there about this as well as many other things. You can catch me at a live storytelling event around town, such as The Moth or Mortified or Perfect Liars Club. And All the Ghosts in the Machine is my book, The Digital Afterlife of Your Personal Data. You can find it where all good books are sold or on Amazon if you must.
Well, Elaine, thank you so much for spending time with us here on the show and talking about this fascinating topic. I've learned so much, and best of luck with the book.
Thanks, Lawrence. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.